Hello, everybody, and welcome back for another edition of Ukraine This Week with me, Don Arleth. Negotiations continue. We are still led to believe that the only issues are the territory of the Donbas and the future of the Zaporizhia Nuclear Power Plant. The Russians and Ukrainians might sit down again in Abu Dhabi on Sunday. Meanwhile, a week-long ceasefire on Ukraine's energy infrastructure was agreed upon by Vladimir Putin at President Trump's personal request. But was it really? This week, we got a picture of the colossal war losses of the Russians in a report by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, making this war the worst anywhere in the world since the Second World War. We'll discuss these issues and more with our guests, but first, let's take a look at this report. The southern port city of Odessa came under repeated Russian attack this week. The deadliest of these strikes took place on Tuesday. 4 were killed and dozens wounded in a powerful drone strike on an apartment building. The same day, a Russian drone hit a civilian passenger train with 291 people on board in the Kharkiv region. 6 of them were killed in the attack. Ukrainian authorities described the strike as an act of terrorism. Moscow's relentless attacks have crippled Ukraine's energy infrastructure. As of Friday, almost 400 apartment buildings in the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, remain without heating.
It's very hard to live without electricity. It makes you want to cry. The thermometer there shows 3 degrees. In the morning, it was 2. If it's 4 degrees in here now, I don't know. It will be negative 20 outside soon. It will be a disaster and people won't survive. They won't endure it.
In the coming days, the temperatures may drop to as low as minus 23 degrees in Kyiv. As Ukraine braces for a dangerous cold spell, U.S. President Donald Trump asked Vladimir Putin to temporarily suspend his attacks.
And I personally asked President Putin not to fire into Kiev and the various towns for a week, and he agreed to do that.
The Kremlin on Friday clarified that the pause will only apply to Kyiv and last only until Sunday, February 1st, rather than a whole week. The residents of Kyiv are not taking the claims seriously.
I trust neither Putin nor Trump, so I think that even if Putin complies now, he will stockpile missiles and will keep firing. Putin's goal is the destruction of Ukraine.
I don't trust this. The Ukrainian people have been promised so much. So many things have happened, and unfortunately, those promises are not being fulfilled.
Despite the unsure nature of the pause in Russian attacks, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has praised the idea and thanked his American counterpart.
I'm grateful to the American side for their efforts to halt the strikes on our energy infrastructure at this time, and we hope the United States will be able to secure an agreement.
A new round of peace talks was scheduled to take place in Abu Dhabi this coming Sunday, but Ukraine's Zelensky said that the date and place still may change.
Ukraine is ready for meetings, Ukraine is ready for decisions, and we expect our partners to be able to act as effectively as possible in Europe, in the United States, everywhere, exactly as required for a lasting peace.
Ukraine's Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha says Russia appears to be taking a more pragmatic approach to peace talks, signaling a willingness to engage with Kyiv. The Ukrainian leader was invited to attend talks with Vladimir Putin in Moscow. However, he rejected the invitation, despite the Kremlin's claims that it can provide the Ukrainian president with adequate security. Zelensky added he's ready to meet, but in a more appropriate format, openly inviting Putin to Ukraine. As Russia continues waging its war of terror, casualties mount. The Center for Strategic and International Studies reported that the Russian military has suffered 1.2 million casualties since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, with Ukrainian losses at less than half of Russia's. And now, joining us to discuss the latest developments in Ukraine is Peter Zamayev, Director of Eurasia Democracy Initiative. Hello, Peter, and thanks again for joining us on Ukraine This Week.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you. I'd like to start off with this energy ceasefire. We heard from Donald Trump that he convinced Vladimir Putin to have a ceasefire for about a week on the critical infrastructure. However, Vladimir Putin is claiming that it's just until February 1st, which is on Sunday. So did Trump, do you think, get played again? Does he, why the discrepancy here in this announcement?
Well, I think the Russians are probably referring to some initial conversation that Donald Trump said, where he may have put something to the effect that Ukrainians are suffering. It's looking bad. We're like negotiating in Abu Dhabi and all these different places, and a city of 4 million people, such as Kiev, and hundreds of thousands of its residents have gone without water, with steady supply of water and basic warmth for weeks now. I mean, this makes me look bad. And so the question is, when did they speak? And apparently, since then, there was already a violation of that gentlemanly agreement, whatever that may have been, when Odessa was targeted. And as you probably reported in your programming, passenger train was targeting, resulting in 5 deaths. So be that as it may, I mean, obviously we understand that Vladimir Putin finds this sort of request hard to avoid and hard to sort of ignore. He wants to continue staying in Donald Trump's good books. He does not want any additional sanctions. He knows of Donald Trump's unpredictability. At the same time, he's facing the ire and the sheer, dismay by his warmongering, chattering classes on Telegram channels, those so-called war correspondents, who are up in arms about this sort of concession. They see this terror against civilians in Ukraine as the direct path that Russia has to victory, seeing how it's been advancing at a very slow pace. And so finally they have sort of started to sense that, if we are talking about a potential evacuation of the entire capital, and this is what they want to do, this will result in untold humanitarian complications. And of course, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of potential new refugees spilling over Europe's borders. That, in Vladimir Putin's sort of Machiavellian kind of playbook, could create more problems for the current governments, would probably propel more right-wing politicians throughout Europe who would demand a cessation of Ukraine's support. This is the sort of game that Vladimir Putin is playing. But be that as it may, let me just wrap up by saying that even if that was such an agreement, and if it's a 1-week lull that Russia hasn't even adhered to properly. Just the other night, just last night, there was additional shelling of Ukraine's infrastructure. It didn't happen to be energy infrastructure. It was other infrastructure. So what exactly is the use of it? And finally, let's go back to Donald Trump's election promise when he said he will solve this conflict, this war, within 24 hours. And right now, he's parading in front of the American public, in front of the world, as a great progress, this gentlemanly agreement to cease firing on Ukraine's energy systems for just 1 week. What a long path, right? Mm-hmm. From solving the war within 24 hours to begging Putin to stop firing against, Ukrainian power infrastructure for just 1 week. So that's I think pretty dramatic when we juxtapose it like that.
Yeah, and I wonder what is even the point when we know that we know the schedule of production of certain missiles, drones, and what have you. They're just going to stockpile this until this week has concluded, or on Sunday, and they'll unleash a massive attack, again targeting the critical infrastructure. So is it maybe perhaps naive to even enter into such agreements for, like, say, a week-long ceasefire?
I guess it is, but once again, Donald Trump operates, from what I can see, on these 1-2 week news cycles, right? It's been a policy by schizophrenia, if you will. I don't necessarily want or mean to be derogatory towards the American president, but we're seeing this kind of mind-boggling proliferation of crises and threats, and now we're talking about an ultimatum on Iran and Cuba, and before that, the capture of Maduro, the crackdown on demonstrations in Minnesota. It is hard to see how Ukraine could command Donald Trump's proper attention, or proper attention not just of his but of his team. Their attention is not infinite, right? It's very much finite. The oxygen has been taken up, and by other crises, and so I'm afraid that we won't see the same sort of attention we would like to see paid to Ukraine, with all these other issues, and of course the Epstein files, that for a myriad of domestic concerns and potential and current scandals that Donald Trump is facing. So he constantly just needs to generate sound bites, right? These are not anything but sound bites, and in the sort of rush for these sound bites to throw to his public, to like, here's another breakthrough, here's what we need to talk about, let's forget this, let's talk about this. I'm afraid that we are sacrificing the perspective of a durable peace in Ukraine, because once again the administration lacks the bandwidth required to prosecute this properly. And now we're hearing that the two gentlemen who have been involved in these talks in Abu Dhabi, and before these different rounds in Moscow, in Florida, Mar-a-Lago, Jared Kushner, Donald Trump's son-in-law, and Stephen Witkoff, they will not be taking part in this coming negotiation. So there are many different questions, and I suspect, and I'm afraid, that the administration simply does not have the resources currently to devote to this major issue of our day.
Right. Well, we also had Vladimir Putin inviting Zelensky for negotiations in Moscow. Zelensky rejected, obviously, and invited Putin to Kyiv. Is this just a simple Russian tactic of appearing to show goodwill by proposing something that's impossible for Ukrainians?
I think very much so, but at the same time, it is an attempt to increase pressure on the Ukrainians, because I wouldn't put it past Donald Trump to say, well, hey, go to Moscow. This is the way to do it. We remember the previous statements by his vice president J.D. Vance, who said, we are all for the two nations to mend bridges and to start engaging in cultural dialogue. I mean, all sounds good, right? This sounds good on paper. This sounds good to the uninitiated. But people who've been involved in this bloody war for 4 years, I mean, the trauma is such that it's just simply impolitic and inappropriate to be talking about mending bridges with people who are dead set on exterminating you as a culture and as a country. But who in the White House really knows or cares about this sort of thing? So I can see Donald Trump coming to the Ukrainian officials and saying, look, this is a very generous offer. Look, I met with Putin in Alaska. I would go to Moscow. There's nothing to be afraid of. He has guaranteed your safety there. So this is a clever and kind of sinister Byzantine kind of trick that Putin is playing on Zelensky, knowing full well Zelensky will not take this, I would say, very clearly fatal step. He may anything can happen. He may follow the fate of Mr. Prigozhin, right? His plane may explode in the skies. I mean, we all know how there's still a lot of concern in Poland about how the past president, Mr. Kaczynski, died over the skies of Russia. Many Poles believe that this was not simply an accident. I won't go any further than that. So, but Donald Trump, I don't think he really cares, or he knows, or he wants to care about what would happen to Zelensky. So this is a devious kind of ploy. And don't forget, it's probably also that Vladimir Putin knows it's not going to happen. It's an easy kind of offer to make, because he himself has, I think, boxed himself in before when he has ruled out meeting with Zelensky, whom he considers an illegitimate president, a usurper of power.
On Sunday, negotiations may resume between Russia and Ukraine in the UAE, as you referenced. What are your expectations for this meeting? Will it be productive without the U.S. present?
Well, I think I don't want to just right off the bat say it's not going to be productive. There are many different ways it could be packaged. It could be, I think, given, to the public as, some sort of progress. Mostly we've seen the progress kind of proceeds along the lines of they have met and they have agreed to meet again, right, to continue the talks. They have separated at the behest of Witkoff and Kushner the idea of territorial concessions from the rest. So they've been negotiating, hashing out differences between, first of all, the U.S. and Ukraine about everything else. And now we're going to see how Ukraine engages with Russia directly on the issue of everything but territorial concessions. And I think Russians are amenable to that as long as it's just talks, because at the end of the day, as Ushakov has said, as Peskov has said, as everyone has said, unless there is a hard territorial concession on the table right off the bat, they can't really talk about serious, prospect of peace agreement. And as you know, it's not just some kind of signing off on the current line of engagement, right? The Russians want the rest of the Donbas. Russians want something that's very similar to their offer for Zelensky to come to Moscow. They know that if Zelensky were to agree to anything like this, to finally withdraw from the territory of Donbas that it still controls, he will be swept out of office. I don't want to speculate on how. This will create serious disturbances in the elites and among the populace in Ukraine. So he also knows that, and he thinks it's also a win-win for him if pushing it, chaos in Kiev is very much what he to see, and so this is where we are. Putin also thinks that he has nothing to lose from dragging out these negotiations. He is avoiding the worst of potential new sanctions from Trump, and he still is, I think, betting on bringing Ukrainians to their knees, whether, if not at the front lines. Well, as I've said, it's probably the slowest. I just recently picked up this line from a British newspaper that did a very detailed study of military engagements the last 100 years, and it's the slowest military advance that we've had in 100 years. Putin knows it's not working out so well for him. Ukrainian armed forces are not buckling, and they're not running away, right? They're still in the game. So, but he thinks he can knock out our electricity once and for all. And so dragging out these talks is also something that Putin can live with.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you, let's stay on this thread. The Zaporizhia Nuclear Power Plant and the Donbas seem to be the major issues here. Is there not something, I mean, you got to step outside maybe Kyiv and say, if there's not something that could be potentially done. I know how difficult it would be for for Ukraine to give up the Donbas, but then you have Enerhodar, and you have the largest nuclear power plant in all of Europe occupied by the Russians. Presumably, we could expect that Ukraine would want that back. Maybe there's a give and take there. What do you think the solution is to these maximalist demands that Russia take over the Donbas, and this stalemate that we see between the two sides?
Like, as I said before, both sides have sort of boxed themselves in a priori when it comes to these territories. It's part of Ukraine's law that to be negotiating away the rightful land of Ukraine is against the constitution and is criminally punishable. The same way with the Russians. You saw that 2 years ago, Putin's extravaganza of signing ceremony, through which the four oblasts, the four regions of Ukraine became part of Russia proper, which is Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Luhansk. So all of this, I think, is moot to be talking about when we take that into account, when we don't take into account what Putin says or doesn't say, but what the people behind him or around him say, like Dmitry Medvedev in his Telegram channel. There's no talk about any of these concessions. This is part of Russia proper. So all this talk by Witkoff and company about let's create a duty-free, free trade zone in the Donbas. let's see if we can have a joint sovereignty, joint kind of management over the Zaporizhia, nuclear plant, and see if Russia can also benefit from it. And why would Russia agree to it if they consider it as part of their own territory? That's why we see the dragging of feet in these talks, is because Vladimir Putin is pursuing his maximalist goal of bringing Ukraine to its knees, and he does that by outright controlling these 4 oblasts, and then he will proceed to try to knock out Odessa, essentially turn Ukraine into a landlocked state. So there's several stages that eventually wind up in that same point. Ukraine ceases to exist as a viable state, and then you can sort of imagine all the different scenarios. Let's say, if right-wing parties continue to come to power in various European states, as I think the blueprint was laid out years ago, where Putin would probably be amenable to the idea of, let's say, Hungary taking over part of Ukraine that is populated in large part by Hungarian speakers. Yeah. There are Romanian speakers. There are, forgive me, Polish speakers in the city of Lviv. Yeah. And we've heard it from the Russian propagandists years ago that, maybe it should belong to Poland. Maybe we'll be willing to negotiate with the Polish to see. So essentially a carving up of Ukraine, the same way that we saw with Molotov and Ribbentrop. And that's how you remember World War II started. A lot of very menacing, very disconcerting, troubling historical parallels.
Yeah, on that thread, I've spoken to a lot of Ukrainian prisoners of war that were held in Russian captivity, and they were constantly told that all of Western Ukraine has been annexed by Poland. That was the disinformation that they were fed. I'd like to turn attention to the Institute for the Study of War has said in a report some time ago that at the current pace, it would take Russians still at least 3 years to take control of the Donbas by force. But we all know about this major manpower shortage in Ukraine and the reported 200,000 soldiers who have gone AWOL. Do you believe that the ISW assessment is still valid? And is time on Ukraine's side here?
I respect what the Institute does, but a lot of it sometimes has seemed to me as wishful thinking, simply because in war, you can't predict that far ahead. The 3 years, it's not, of course, we're not talking about linear progression, right? But 3 years will proceed with all these other contextual background factors that have a direct bearing on the way this war is being prosecuted. Let's imagine worst case scenario: America decides to completely withdraw intelligence sharing with the Ukrainians. If Elon Musk decides to switch off all Ukrainian Starlinks, let's imagine Macron leaves power and Marine Le Pen assumes presidency, right? What kind of politics will that be, right? There's all these other things. And of course, things are not static in Ukraine. There continues to be an exodus of young men, sometimes due to the folly of our government that recently, as you probably reported as well, decided to let a certain group, I think the youngest, 18 to 21, were granted it permission to leave Ukraine. And sure enough, over 100,000 young men, potential defenders of the country, left, probably never to come back, or at least in the near future. So all these things are very contingent. So we cannot look that far ahead. Having said that, of course, Russians are not proceeding as fast as they would like. There's no clear answer to that issue other than calling for a new massive mobilization, and Putin, wants by all means to avoid that. But the question is, how many more men does Russia have who are willing to go and essentially die or be maimed to provide for their family's mortgage, or to allow their bereaved, women, their widows, to buy a car when the man dies and his compensation is paid out to the family. That is also a finite, number of men. We don't know once it's reached. And so there's all these many different questions, and therefore I would not be so hopeful when we're talking about 3 years. And once again, Russia's economy is fragile. But the question is it fragile enough for Putin to wind down the war effort? Does Putin have money to continue waging this war at current levels? He probably does.
Right. Well, it is a difficult situation, and of course, we'll just have to see where all these developments take us. Peter Zamayev, I always appreciate your analysis on these matters. You're very good at it. Director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
And that's all the time we have on this edition of Ukraine This Week. Join us again next week for all the latest from the war in Ukraine. Thanks for watching, and hope to see you then. Goodbye.